When I was an undergraduate here in the middle of the 80s, I heard Elizabeth Pond come to speak at BYU, and at the time she was the Moscow correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. And I had just read her book from the Yaroslavsky Station. And I was a baseball player at the time, and I don't know if you know this about baseball players, but we don't study very much. And the book was incredibly interesting to me. It was a story of her journey across then the USSR. And I remember, what I remember most is having a notebook where I would write down in the margin all the words I didn't know, and would go look them up later. And about 20 years later, I met Beth in Germany, where she has been living for some years, first in Bonn and now in Berlin. And we worked together on a series of sort of foreign policy workshops that traveled around Germany. And we did this, I think, at least three different years. And so in the meantime, we've gotten to know each other quite well. And I've always been so impressed with her ability to ask the penetrating question with whoever we were with, and to distill the pertinent information from the speakers. And she is here today to talk about her latest in a long cycle of books about contemporary European politics that go back to German unification, a book on the unification of Europe, and now this most recent book, which is called Endgame in the Balkans, and has the interesting subtitle, Regime Change European Style. The book covers a wide swath of the geographical area known as the Balkans. In fact, touches on everything really except Turkey, which I guess is a subject unto itself. Beth is a working journalist for the Washington Quarterly, has for the past several years edited the Transatlantic Internationale Politik, the Transatlantic version of that very fine journal, and has been a fellow of a number of institutions, mostly in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Institute of Peace, and a number of others. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the U.S. and the Council on Foreign Relations in Germany, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and Women in International Security. When I read this most recent book, I found two more words that I had to write down and look up, politotrope and appurtenances. So I continue to learn things from Beth Pond, and I congratulate you on the practice of coming to these outside lectures, because they will make a big difference in your education. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Elizabeth Pond.
After that introduction, I have to confess that politotrope was a word that my editor did not like, and I had to fight to keep it in the book. I'm beginning to get alarmed at the number of introducers I have in the United States who became acquainted with me when they were undergraduate. This doesn't apply to the case of Wade, but the person who introduced me yesterday is by now white-haired, and when he said that he first read me when he was a graduate student, I thought, uh-oh. I'd like to ask you to think for a moment about some of today's typical front-page headlines. 60% increase in Taliban attacks in Afghanistan, 40, 50, sometimes 60 corpses found after overnight killings in Baghdad. Six or 7 years ago, you read the same sort of headlines about the Balkans, and especially about the almost 8,000 unarmed Muslim men and boys who were massacred by Serb soldiers in Srebrenica. That was the worst atrocity in Europe since World War II and the Holocaust. But think for a minute what the headlines are that you've read about the Balkans recently. Can you think of any? Can anybody think of a headline you've seen? Yeah.
Some Balkan states are thinking about joining the European Union.
Yeah, okay. It's a very different kind of headline about the, and that probably was on an inside page, actually. Since they aren't, sorry, you were going to, yeah. And because in fact, the war has been ended as the default mode of resolving disputes in the Balkans. Now, this is extraordinary, if you think about it. If you think about the murders and counter-murders and the kind of spiral that this sets up in the early 90s in Croatia and Bosnia, in 1999 in Kosovo. And yet, something has been going right there. The peacekeeping troops the peacekeeping troops in Bosnia, Internationale, have not lost a single soldier to hostile action. Again, this is extraordinary. And so what I have been trying to explore in this book is what has gone right there and why. And why are regime changes actually taking place in the Balkans in a direction that we would approve as modernizing, democratizing, and generally civilizing. I ended up more optimistic than when I started. I didn't know this was my question when I started. When I started, my question was, can outside intervention work to modernize, to democratize, to civilize? And to my surprise, after 5 years of working on this book, I have become more optimistic about the possibilities. Now, there are several circumstances in the Balkans that are quite different from other parts of the world, but one of the most important ones is precisely this. It's the pull of the European Union and the drive for European Union membership. Now, there may not always be a very sophisticated understanding of what this means. For the man on the street, it probably means I'd like to be able to travel in Western Europe with no visas or with getting visas with very little fuss. Or it will mean, Western Europe is peaceful and is prosperous. We'd like to be peaceful and prosperous. If we join the EU, we will be too. But the dynamic that it has set up is that it's the prime example of soft power. And that is making others want what you want. The EU has made others want to become members of the EU so much that the EU is a little scared of everybody who's lining up outside the door and wants to get in. But it has created a dynamic where this desire to become a member, to get into this blessed club, is strong enough, in certain cases, to pull them through the really painful reforms. Now, these are difficult. The kind of development of politics, of economics, of social life that we've had in the United States, in Britain, in Germany, we've developed these over 150, 200 years. The people in the Balkans are having to do this in one generation, in one lifetime. And it is painful. There's a lot of indigestion involved with this. And there are a lot of unsolved problems, but the direction is going, again, as I say, to my surprise, when I finished adding up the evidence, are going in a positive direction. So let me just summarize a little bit what I've found. And the summary, in a way, is antithetical to what I tried to do in the book, because there is no such thing as the Balkans. Everything is different. Every country is different. Every land is different in the Balkans from every other. And every corner of every land is different. And so there's no general dynamics. You can't sort of say you can't sort of say, well, here are the economic developments, and Bosnia shows X, and Serbia shows Y, and Bulgaria shows Z, because it just doesn't work that way. The dynamics is different. What I've tried to do in my country chapters is to look at these dynamics and to examine each of the turning points, which were different in different cases. And I'll try to do a little bit of this. But the fact is that what I see as the value of my book is, in fact, the detail. One of the endorsers of my book, Robert Cooper, who is the top advisor to Javier Solana, more or less the EU foreign minister, put it nicely when he said, considering the relatively positive conclusions I came to, he said that the angel, too, is in the detail. Well, I'm going to start out with some generalizations, which, as I say, is antithetical to the book, but at least it'll be a basis for discussion. Then we can go on. I'll try not to talk too much because I'd like to leave it open for questions and discussion. So the first thing, the first success is, in fact, this ending of wars. The second is the empowering of local reformers, some of whom didn't know they were reformers before this process started. And this is something that Wade Jacoby has written very cogently about. and I endorse his arguments. I think this is very important. So the second is this empowering of local actors. The third is institution building, which again is an extremely difficult and complex thing. It involves rule of law, which the outsiders have sort of come to belatedly, or people who are interested in this kind of development, whether it's in Iraq and Afghanistan or in the Balkans, have realized the importance of this. But it's a very complicated process, and all of these things have to be done at the same time. It's a problem of simultaneity. You know, where do you start? And how do you persuade the elites who have been in power that they should give up some of their perks, some of their power for reasons? Well, you probably won't convince them for reasons of the greater good. You probably have to do it on the basis of if they have become millionaires in the privatizations, then you hope that they want to have rule of law to protect their new wealth, something like that. So that's institution building. The fourth point is, I think, that a critical mass has finally been reached in the Balkans, where the striving of one country to qualify for the rather difficult terms, rather demanding terms of membership, is having an impact on the neighbors, in the sense that if you see that Croatia has won full candidacy for membership, you think, hey, I don't want to get left behind. Maybe we will have to pull up our socks and make some of these reforms more serious and do them better than we have been doing them. Okay, let me then jump to sort of a rundown of some of the specific countries, and then I'll be happy to go in any direction that you would like to go about specific countries or about other questions. Bosnia. Again, the major impact of outside intervention was ending the war. And this included also, in the first period, in the early period, getting refugees back. In Bosnia, you will recall, half of the population, 2 million out of 4 million, were made homeless. They were displaced. And initially, the refugees were not brought back to the areas they had come from. Others moved in and occupied the houses or the apartments of those who had been kicked out in ethnic cleansing. But through a process that began in Sarajevo and then extended throughout the rest of the country, and through the protection that the peacekeepers provided for those who returned, which was done seriously, 1 million of the refugees came back to their homes. Some of them, many of them, even to areas where they were minorities. And the other 1 million refugees seem to have gone to other countries or have settled with relatives or elsewhere. So that this is a real accomplishment in Bosnia. And then there has been steady progress in the direction of actually making Bosnia operate as a single country. Because, of course, what the Dayton Agreement that ended the fighting set up was a Rube Goldberg construction of two entities, one the Republika Srpska, where the Serbs were, and the other the Federation of the Croats and Muslims, plus 10 cantons. And it just layer after layer of government and just an impossible construction. So the first thing was, or one of the first things was, they got unified license plates, so that you couldn't immediately tell if somebody came into the Republika Srpska that he was a Muslim or a Croat, and could be the target of revenge or attack. Then they unified customs, and the customs is kind of funny because what they're all striving for is a free trade area. So in the meantime, the customs has become the most important source of revenue. So this is setting up some problems for the future. Okay, nonetheless, they have set up a single customs service. They've set up a single police intelligence service, and they have unified the army. You may have heard cynics say, well, they've unified the army, but there's still ethnic regiments, the Serb, the Croat, and the Muslim or Bosniak regiments, and therefore it isn't real. Well, yeah, but the counter-argument is that not only do you have a single command on paper, a single chief of staff, but you also have a single budget. And it's pretty hard to do anything with one regiment if you don't have the budget, if you don't have the money to get your troops to march. Okay, Macedonia. What the outside intervention has done is to pull them back from the brink, to get the ethnic Albanians and the ethnic Slavs in the country to agree, kicking and screaming, on certain steps that they were going to take, to give the other a political voice. And this has been constantly tested, but it has held, in large part, perhaps because the Macedonians, the Albanians in Macedonia, saw what happened elsewhere, and they didn't want to fall into that and have the same kind of destruction and death. Croatia. This is perhaps the clearest example of the impact of the desire for EU membership on any country, because it not only brought about the reforms, but it also tamed the extremist nationalists. Now, President Tudjman did his country the favor of dying early on, which was a considerable contribution because he was not indicted by the International Court in The Hague. And so there wasn't this hurdle to jump over as there has been in Serbia. But then what happened was not necessarily to be predicted, because, first of all, President Mesic was elected, who was a moderate, and began doing things even so far as going himself to testify at the Hague Tribunal against Hague indicted war criminals. And what happened in the last election in Croatia was that Prime Minister Sanader, he's still the Prime Minister, who was from Tudjman's party, the HDZ, very skillfully began marginalizing the extremists within the party. There's still quite a few of these guys around, some of them in Parliament, but it's nothing like the way it was before, where they were sort of determining the dynamics and running the policies. And the test of this was at the end of last year, when Gotovina, who was the important indicted war criminal suspect, who was still a fugitive from the International Court, was finally captured in the Canary Islands and sent to The Hague for trial. Now, what's interesting, there are a couple of things that are interesting here. One is that if you compare the demonstrations, the nationalist demonstrations against the first Croat officer to be indicted, first Croat general to be indicted by the Hague Tribunal, there were mass demonstrations throughout the country. And by the time Gotovina was arrested, there were demonstrations in Dalmatia along the coast, which is a stronghold of hardline nationalists. But there were very, very few and very small demonstrations in Zagreb or in other parts of the country. So things had calmed down considerably. And the other part of that was that the Croats were cooperating very extensively with the Hague Tribunal at that point, in a way that the Serbs are still not doing. And they gave security information. See, in this area, those who have been protecting the indicted, the war crimes indictees, have been basically the security forces, the official security forces. And so it's been a very difficult process of going against this and going against the sentiment that these guys are our heroes, because they were defending Croats or they were defending Serbs when they were murdering others. And so the Croat government actually gave international police the information that they needed in order to arrest Gotovina. And the reward of Croatia was that they were accepted at this point as a full candidate for membership for the European Union. So they've got a leg up on everybody else in ex-Yugoslavia. All right, jump to Romania. In Romania, for many years, it seemed until last year actually, it seemed as if the Romanians, Romanian politicians, were skilled throughout the years and rather noted for being able to say one thing and to pass laws and then do another, which was to stuff their own pockets with money and not have to pay for it politically. Well, what happened last year was that, see, Romania and Bulgaria were originally supposed to come into the European Union as members in 2004, along with the Central Europeans, the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, and so forth. And they weren't up to it yet. They didn't qualify. So at the last minute, the EU said to both Bulgaria and Romania, you can come in, but you can't come in now. You can come in the future. And if you're good, you can come in at the beginning of 2007. If you're not good, you can come in at the beginning of 2008. And this didn't seem to have a particular galvanizing effect in combating corruption, which was a key issue, maybe the key issue in Romania, until last year. And then there was a funny thing that happened in the elections, and it was almost accidental, and I won't go into that unless you want to. But what happened was that a minister of justice was appointed who was beholden to no one. She had been a civil rights lawyer before that. And she began going after some of those who were most suspected of corruption among very high officials, which was something that had not happened before. At this point, the former prime minister and I think maybe 10 top politicians are under indictment or investigation for corruption. The former prime minister is a particularly interesting case, perhaps because he, under laws that the European Union required, but that have not necessarily had the effect that was intended, there has to be a certain declaration of wealth on the part of candidates, and so he declared that an aunt of his in Georgia, that is Georgia in the Caucasus, whom no one had ever heard of before, had died and left him a legacy of some prime real estate in the middle of Bucharest. He's also noted for a very, very fine art collection. Okay, Bulgaria. Bulgaria is an interesting case because Bulgaria was the slowest of any of the countries in this region to begin to change the system. Of course, what happened when the Soviet Union and first the Soviet external empire and then the internal Russian empire broke up was that the same elites who had been there, the same communist elites who had been ruling, sort of continued into the new era. They just called themselves different things. They called themselves liberals, or they called themselves conservatives, or they called themselves social democrats or something else, but it was basically the same elites. And this happened in Romania, in Bulgaria as well as elsewhere. This is something of a simplification, but basically it's right. And finally, in 1996, 1997, the economy became so bad with hyperinflation and so forth and so on that there were demonstrations on the street against the government. And the government, in fact, resigned. Again, not a foregone conclusion, but it worked that way with a lot of external pressure from the Americans and the Europeans. And Bulgaria went cold turkey. They set up a currency board, which they have adhered to ever since. I think it must be the only country in the world where a currency board is popular. They invited back the Turks, ethnic Turks, whom the previous communist government had kicked out as they were shifting over from communism as the legitimation for their government to nationalism as the legitimation, invited them back into the country and reintegrated them. And then things sort of seemed to go into limbo for a while, and certainly on the question of corruption. If you hear about any of the gang murders in the Balkans, probably what you hear about is those in Sofia. or in its suburb of Amsterdam sometimes, of the gang warfare. And Bulgaria didn't seem to be doing too much in the direction of going after corruption either. But then in the last year, as Bulgaria and Romania were trying to gear up and trying to persuade the EU, well, we really should come in right away in January of next year, Bulgaria, first of all, balked at this. And then when it saw that Romania was going ahead on some of these things, invited in a Dutch prosecutor, former Dutch prosecutor, to help. And they I forget how many, I think it's 10 members of parliament have now had their immunity stripped so that their charges of corruption can be tried in the courts. And for the first time ever, they have indicted several, they have extradited several of those whom the Italians have accused, have indicted of organized crime, have extradited them to Italy. First time they've extradited anybody to stand trial. So things are beginning to move there on that count too. Albania has even more problems maybe than any of the other countries in the Balkans, because until 1989, 1990, and the changes and the end of communism, Albania was just hermetically sealed against the rest of the world. Hoxha, the strongman, had first of all was going to go with Tito in Yugoslavia, then they broke up, and then he had Stalin as his patron, and then when the Russians got too liberal for his taste, then he had the Chinese as his patrons. And some of my Albanian friends who wanted to study abroad, the only way they could do it was to learn Chinese and go to Beijing, to the university, to study. So they've, and even in, as recently as the mid-1980s, there was almost no vehicle traffic. There were certainly no private vehicles in Tirana. And there were, and what trucks they had gotten from the Chinese. In the meantime, they'd broken up with the Chinese too, so they didn't have anybody. And they sort of were absolutely paranoid. They were going to be attacked by NATO. They were going to be attacked by the Yugoslavs. They were going to be attacked by the Warsaw Pact, whoever. And they built all these absolutely crazy, which you can still see all over the country, these sort of two-man bunkers that wouldn't protect anybody against anything. But in any case. And you could still see then toward the end of the 1980s, after the break with China, you could see these broken down old Chinese buses or trucks being pulled by horses because they didn't have the spare parts and couldn't repair them. So suddenly Albania is plunged into this modern world and totally unprepared for it. And there's a serious problem of organized crime. There's a serious problem of organized crime everywhere in the Balkans. But maybe nowhere is it worse than in Albania and Kosovo, in part because the mafias there are held within families. It's very, very much comparable to the old Italian mafias, and they learned some of their tricks of the trade from the Italian mafias. And one of the tricks that they learned in recent years was that the Italian mafias got lax about the omerta, about absolutely punishing anybody with death who gave information, and so they are determined that they are not going to make the same mistake. So they're very, very hard to infiltrate, much more so than the other gangs. Also, in Albania and in Kosovo, there hasn't been the beginning of the building of institutions, as there has in most of the other countries or most of the other lands in the Balkans. For various reasons, it just hasn't started. They started at a lower level. The economic problems in Albania, the poverty level is worse than in the rest of the Balkans, particularly among the large percentage of the population, majorities under 25, maybe under, I don't remember what the exact line is of the breakdown. And unemployment in Kosovo in this age group is 70%. There's just nothing for them to do, and so they're enormous problems, and they just haven't started to build the institutions at all. I'm not going to talk too much about the issue of independence for Kosovo. What I will do is I'll say what I expect to be the outcome of the talks or of the international community forcing both sides with as much agreement as they can get to accept it. And then if you want to talk about that a little bit more, we can. I think that what is going to happen is that Kosovo, in fact, will receive conditional independence early next year. And that will mean that the European Union, in some form, will still have control, or will have control of foreign policy, of security policy, but not of domestic policy. In other words, they will be sovereign in domestic policy, but not in foreign policy and not in security policy. This leaves open questions of the army, of an army. It leaves open questions of the UN seat, which is probably going to be the symbolic fight, where the symbolic fight is going to take place. Serbia, in many ways, I'm more concerned about Serbia than I am about any other country in the region. You know, we all know what Milosevic did to, and his troops did, and his drive for Greater Serbia did to the Croats, to the Bosniaks, and to the Kosovar Albanians. But what is less well known is what he also did to the Serbs. Because the Serbs started with a very sophisticated set of institutions, very highly developed professional class, middle class. Probably your parents at least think of Yugoslavia as being the best of the communist world, which it was. And they could travel, they were freer, they had a reasonably decent standard of living. And this has been destroyed by Milosevic. I forget what the exact figures are of the exodus of the professionals who got squeezed out, incidentally, in the hyperinflation and the embargoes in the 1990s during the wars of Yugoslav succession. And so, it's something like 800,000 or so of the middle class, of the professionals who have emigrated because they simply couldn't live in Serbia anymore. That's a terrible loss to the country. I don't think that the Serb public at this point is extremist nationalist. They might have been if Milosevic had won and they'd gotten a Greater Serbia. But they see the misery that he brought about at this point, and I've heard estimates that I think are probably pretty good by Serbs I know who say that probably no more than 15% of the population could be considered extremist nationalist. But the problem is that those who are extremist nationalists within the elites have captured politics. They've hijacked politics. So that the driving force of what is going to be the election in December of this year, early election, is going to be, to a certain extent, who lost Montenegro, because Montenegro got its independence a couple of months ago from Serbia, but much more so, who lost Kosovo. And Kosovo has been hyped since the 19th century, but particularly under Milosevic as the grievance of the Serbs. And this the sort of the historic cradle of the Serbs, and this has to stay with us or we lose our identity. Combined with this is a mentality of which has been historical and was certainly played upon by Milosevic, of the Serbs seeing themselves as the special victims throughout history. And what the manifestation of it today is perhaps, a feeling that here we Serbs, we managed to get rid of Milosevic. We managed to get a functioning democracy, and it is very much a functioning democracy. We have a certain independence of courts, not all of the judges, but there are enough courts who are independent, enough judges who are independent to be really effective, and you can talk of rule of law. We have all these things. We're much more democratic than the Kosovars are. So why should we be punished for something that Milosevic did. We got rid of Milosevic. Why should we be blamed for him? So there's this feeling, this sort of resentment that is not very healthy and continues to feed into the politics. I'll talk about one more sign of hope that I see in general, which I think is quite important. And this, again, is something that hasn't gotten much attention. It's a very quiet process. But there is a group of scholars, historians from all of the Balkan lands who have gotten together and with funding from various think tanks, have said, we want to write a common history of the Balkans that can be used throughout every country in this region. And we want to present a complex view of history, not the single view that the countries have had in their schools until now, which is we Bulgarians were the ones who were put upon. We were the ones who had to give up our empire. We were the Saint Cyril, Saint Methodius were Bulgarians. We were the good guys, and the others, the Macedonians, the Greeks, etc., were the bad guys. Or if you go to Serbia, just the reverse. The Serbs were the good guys and the others were the bad guys. Same thing if you go to the Albanian history and so forth. Well, what they want to do is cut through this and give a multiple view of history so that the viewpoints of the different ones are represented in the schools. They've already produced one volume in English. They're producing what they're doing is they're working in English, producing a master account in English, and then circulating it, getting comments, getting original materials, which they're then going to translate all of these things into each of the languages. And this really gets at the heart of what you need to do in order to overcome some of the hostilities that have kind of been passed on from generation to generation. And it's also what the whole idea of joining the European Union is about, because the idea is borders don't matter so much. In the same way that France and Germany decided after World War II that they were no longer going to be enemies and they were going to reconcile themselves, it's worked. No young German, no young Frenchman could imagine that their two countries would go to war. And this is what they would like to replicate. And the same thing has gone on this model between the Germans and the Poles, between the Poles and the Ukrainians, to a certain extent between the Ukrainians and the Romanians. So this is the model. And the idea is that under these conditions, the borders won't matter so much, sovereignty won't matter so much. They use the phrase of pooling sovereignty, not giving up sovereignty, but pooling sovereignty to find solutions to problems, environmental, whatever, that you can only do collectively. And so I think there is hope in the Balkans. And again, by contrast to what we see in some other parts of the world these days, I think it's a miracle.